Directed and co-written by Jose Paredes, who previously brought us Heretics. We are talking Evil Nun. And this is a low-budget asylum movie. So, Evil Nun. Now, since The Conjuring 2, we've seen, you know, lots of kind of lower-budget, ghostly nun-type movies. So, this one, if you know anything about the asylum, is obviously going to be a lower budget, you know, creepy nun movie, basically. The story focuses on 7 young people, and they are kind of young people who have come from a kind of a religious background that are going on a tour of churches in Mexico. And their car, kind of, or van breaks down in this particular kind of rural area. But they end up finding a kind of seemingly like a ghost town which has a church there, and the only inhabitant seems to be this priest. But he tells them that he can't help and they need to basically get out of there before nightfall. But they kind of decide they want to just effectively stay the night in this church, because rather than trying to haul back to this kind of car and stuff and maybe look for a phone or something like that, because there's no cell reception and all this. And when they are in this church, there seems to be an otherworldly presence there. Perhaps the ghost of this nun that may have died there and could have been given birth in a kind of immaculate fashion, you might say. And people start dying. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about what I think works in this movie's favour. Now, I would say if you were to start watching this movie not knowing it's an asylum movie, you probably wouldn't realise, I would say. Now, the asylum are renowned for quick turnaround, low budget, you know, not high quality, and mostly mockbusters, but they do, on occasion, do more original kind of, like, especially horror films. Now, arguably, you could say that this movie is a kind of response to the kind of The Conjuring, popularising a kind of, you know, horror nuns, even though there have been kind of horror nuns prior to The Conjuring 2 and everything. But I would say, I have to be honest with you, this one doesn't really play like an asylum movie. Jose Paredes has done quite a few movies for them at this point, but he's done a couple that I haven't minded, actually. And there's a lot to this movie which I think, if you were to not have the asylum logo and you were to watch this not knowing it's an asylum movie, you wouldn't guess it was an asylum film, because it doesn't really feel like that. But why? Why do I say that? I mean, let me give you some examples. For one, I think this movie shoots a lot on location. And I think the location here is a big plus point, because we see this kind of, the externals, this sort of ghost town. You know, it's meant to be Mexican kind of ghost town. And it looks great. I mean, it looks great. It looks like, you know, it looks like it's kind of, you know, abandoned. It looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. And then we kind of go into the internals of this church. So it's not a big church. And I gotta say, it looks like a very rundown kind of rural church. So I think the location here is pretty good, and it kind of has this sort of I don't know, more of an authentic feel than the kind of a lot of the kind of like the sets and stuff that you'll typically kind of see in a lot of asylum movies. And there's a cave system underneath and stuff. I've got to say, it looks pretty creepy. The second thing which I would say is maybe sets this movie apart from a lot of asylum films, I thought the acting was pretty decent. I think everyone here does a fairly decent job of portraying these kind of characters. Now, the interesting thing I found with these characters as well is they're doing like a tour of these churches and stuff, but they're not like complete, I don't know, massively sort of into it, if you know what I mean. I mean, there's one of them which is actually an atheist and just his kind of friends. They're having more of a holiday. One of them kind of like, his father wants him to be a priest, so they're kind of like, they're church goers, but they're not like they're not like zealots or anything like that. So the characters seem like more of your typical kind of like somewhat kind of religious American types who are, you know, who are varying degrees of religion. There's one which is quite pious, down to one that's an atheist. So, and then we have everything kind of in between. But it sort of makes sense because they're doing this kind of, you know, trying to do like a tour of these kind of like local churches and things like that. Why they would be there, why they would kind of know a little bit about the kind of the religious kind of aspects of what's kind of going on and things like that. And I thought it seemed like a fairly decent sort of idea of why this kind of group of people are there. It also makes sense that obviously it being taking place in Mexico, they were kind of out of the way a little bit. There's not, you know, much in the way of kind of like urban sprawl or anything like this. They're out their kind of comfort zone. So I thought the kind of the character work for the backstory of these characters was fairly strong, and their performances, they kind of seemed naturalistic in regards to they weren't kind of like screaming troublemaker teenagers. They were quite sort of mature, but they were still kind of quite on the younger side, and the way they're kind of like speaking to one another and stuff, I thought was fairly strong. But they genuinely like seemed like a group of friends. There wasn't like kind of one that there was like they're kind of bullying, anything like that. So I thought the kind of the way these characters were written, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, which we'll come on to, was strong, and the kind of the performances. And again, when you compare it to a lot of asylum fares, I'm going to say, if you were to watch this and you were to tell me whether this was an asylum movie, you would just think this was kind of like an indie horror that was, you know, independently produced outside of the kind of even a low budget asylum studio like that. So that was pretty good. So I think we have reasonable characters, you know, fair acting, good location, and the pace of this movie is it's slower, but it feels deliberate. So it's not like nothing's happening for ages. You know, it has a kind of escalation, but it takes its time of building up this kind of the setup here. And then, you know, we have a reasonably kind of interesting kind of setup where we learn that there is this nun who, by all intents and purposes, may have been pregnant due to, you know, an immaculate conception. You'll learn more about that as the film goes on, but it's like an interesting sort of facet to the kind of the backstory here, and kind of sets up this kind of the story. I have to say, I think the first act of this movie is very strong, because I think it's, you know, a decent setup, good location, decent characters, and a you know, a good pace. So, you know, we have this kind of this nun that kind of this ghostly nun that kind of shows up, and, you know, it's a lower budget sort of effect, but not bad. Certainly, you know, creepy enough. And then the movie has this sort of twist, which, you know, I think it's relatively obvious. There's some sort of, you know, there's questions that could have been asked. But, you know, it's an interesting sort of twist on what, you know, what you might be expecting necessarily. You know, having a little bit of kind of like unexpected subverting of expectations, but still keeping within what was kind of sort of set up and stuff. And there's a couple of like semi-gory deaths in the movie. So, you know, it's a reasonable sort of like movie so far. So what doesn't work for me? Now, I think the first act is pretty strong, as I say. But what I think this movie lacks is a real lack of fear and sort of scariness. Because I think the setup is all there for it. And then I just don't think it quite pulls the trigger on it. It never really feels particularly scary, especially when you know what's actually going on. And I have to say, when you learn about what has actually happened and the true status quo, it's a little unsatisfying, I would say, especially for more horror fans, because it comes across as more of a thriller movie in some respects. More of a kind of a TV plot, if you want to say. There is, I'm not saying there's not there's not supernatural elements, there is. But yeah, it's not as interesting as I think maybe it could have been. And instead goes for more of a mundane approach. Now, the flip side, it's kind of like trying to kind of like have a little bit of a reveal. I think it's relatively obvious, and as much as I thought quite like the characters, I thought they should be asking more questions at this point, because they've, you know, things have happened. They learn more information as the kind of story goes on. And there was one really big question that you probably would have asked, and they don't ask it. So there's that. But that's the writing. It's not necessarily the actor's fault here. I think some of the writing, as much as I kind of quite like their believability as a group of individuals and a group of friends and stuff, some of the kind of the more plot point elements does let it down a little bit in regards to some of the kind of the sort of things. And even when we have people end up dying. There's one in particular which was a ridiculous death, seemingly sort of come out of nowhere. The third death, let me just say. But even like how people don't really necessarily react when you're a group of 7 young people and a good portion of your friends have died at this point. I think the lack of reaction is a little bit on on the sort of the disappointing side, because I think to this point I think our character seems sort of somewhat kind of realistic and stuff. As the film goes on, I think that the tension lessens because we learn a little bit more about what's going on, and it sort of ends up being not quite as exciting as you kind of might have thought it would be. I think the title of this movie does not do it any favours, both in the fact that it's a really dumb and like on the nose title, and also it's not actually it doesn't really apply to the movie in a way that you would expect looking at that title, because when you watch the movie, it's not exactly indicative of what the actual story is about, is all I'm going to say. So that's not a criticism necessarily of how I would judge it, but it's just, it's not really, the title is not a good title, and then not really apt for the movie anyway. So there you go. But the movie, as we're talking about it, despite a decent setup, decent location, becomes less interesting as the film goes on, and then we kind of, the third act becomes a little bit hammy to a degree, and a little more unbelievable, even though we're talking about ghosts and things. This kind of like people's motivations and things like that becomes a little less believable. And we have a situation where, without trying to spoil anything here, we have a character who's trying to sort of cover their tracks, and instead we get a lot of kind of unnecessarily exposition dumps and sort of monologuing when it doesn't really sort of, if that situation were to happen, people would be taking care of business, is all I'm sort of saying. But again, the movie has to happen. So I think that the writing is maybe where I think the movie is lacking a little bit. And I think the lack of spectacle in regards to what actually happens, and maybe for such a fairly good setup, it ends up not being a particularly kind of scary movie overall. So how to rank this one? No, it's not a bad film. I actually quite enjoyed a lot of aspects of this, but it's just not exactly a memorable film. I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10, to be honest with you. So it's to me, it's actually a fair movie, but it's not one which is a must see. But there were certain aspects here that were done pretty well. I wish it could have gone on to become something a little bit more special, which I think it possibly could have been. But maybe it was a lack of budget. Anyway, 5 out of 10. What were your thoughts? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.
None shall leave this place unless you subscribe